Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
There are moments in the entertainment industry when the conversation shifts from movie premieres and red carpets to something far more serious, something that feels closer to a courtroom drama than a Hollywood storyline. The situation surrounding Blake Lively and the ongoing legal battle connected to Justin Baldoni and the production company Courtroom has slowly evolved into exactly that kind of spectacle. What started as behind-the-scenes tension and accusations has now turned into a legal fight that is being watched closely not just by fans of celebrity culture, but also by people interested in how public narratives and legal strategy collide. And recently, a major development occurred in the courtroom that many observers believe could signal a turning point in the entire dispute. Before getting into the details of the judge's decision, it helps to understand the atmosphere surrounding the case. Over the past year, the legal teams involved have not only been arguing inside the courtroom but also, in various ways, shaping the public conversation outside of it. In high-profile cases involving celebrities, the media becomes a secondary battlefield. Lawyers, publicists, commentators, and even fans begin interpreting every filing, every statement, and every interview as a clue about what might happen next. That environment is exactly where attorney Lars Harry entered the spotlight. Lars Harry, who represents the Courtroom side of the dispute, has occasionally spoken publicly about the case. Like many attorneys involved in high-profile litigation, his comments have been part legal defense, part public explanation, and part strategic messaging. To Blake Lively's legal team, however, those statements crossed a line. They argued that Lars Harry had gone beyond reasonable commentary and had begun attacking Blake Lively's character and credibility in a way that could influence potential jurors. Their response was aggressive. They filed a formal motion asking the judge to sanction Lars Harry under New York's professional conduct rules, specifically Rule 3.6, which governs how attorneys can speak about a case outside the courtroom. The purpose of that rule is straightforward: lawyers should avoid making statements that could materially prejudice a legal proceeding. In other words, if an attorney's public comments could unfairly influence the outcome of a trial by shaping public opinion or contaminating the jury pool, the court has the authority to step in. Blake Lively's legal team argued that this is exactly what had happened. According to their filing, Lars Harry had repeatedly made statements in interviews and public discussions that portrayed Lively as dishonest, manipulative, or afraid of the truth. The motion laid out a long list of examples. In one instance, Lars Harry suggested that Lively was uncomfortable facing the truth. In another, he implied that she had been acting for the cameras long before she ever stepped into the courtroom. The document submitted by her attorneys was lengthy and detailed. Page after page catalogued statements, interviews, and quotes, all presented as evidence that Lars Harry had violated the professional rules governing attorney conduct. The tone of the filing suggested that the issue was not just about a few offhand remarks but about a pattern of behavior. According to Lively's lawyers, Lars Harry's commentary had become a deliberate strategy designed to undermine their client's credibility in the court of public opinion. The motion didn't stop at pointing out the alleged violations. It also asked the court to impose significant consequences. Among the requested sanctions were financial penalties, reimbursement of legal fees, and a formal public reprimand. Perhaps most dramatically, the filing hinted that Lars Harry's ability to participate in the case could be challenged entirely. Because he was admitted to the court as an out-of-state attorney, his permission to practice in this particular case could theoretically be revoked if the judge believed he had repeatedly ignored court rules. That possibility alone raised the stakes enormously. Removing an attorney from a high-profile case is not something courts do lightly. It would have been a major development not only for the legal teams involved but also for the broader narrative surrounding the dispute. If Lars Harry had been sanctioned or removed, it would have sent a strong signal that the judge believed the Courtroom side had crossed a serious line. For weeks, speculation grew about what the judge might decide. Legal commentators discussed the motion online. Fans and observers debated whether the statements cited in the filing were genuinely inappropriate or simply part of the rough-and-tumble nature of high-profile litigation. Some argued that Lars Harry's comments were aggressive but within the boundaries of normal legal advocacy. Others believed that repeatedly attacking the character of an opposing party in public interviews was risky and potentially unethical. Meanwhile, the timeline of the case itself added another layer of complexity. The statements referenced in the motion had been made many months before the expected trial date. At the time the motion was filed, the trial was still far in the future. That timing would eventually become one of the key issues the judge focused on when evaluating the request for sanctions. Eventually, the court issued its decision. And despite the extensive arguments and documentation submitted by Blake Lively's legal team, the judge's response was remarkably brief. Instead of a long, detailed opinion analyzing every statement mentioned in the motion, the court delivered a concise ruling that addressed the core issue directly. The judge explained that even if the statements made by Lars Harry were assumed to fall outside the safe harbor protections of Rule 3.6, Blake Lively's team had failed to demonstrate something essential, that those statements were likely to materially prejudice the proceedings. In other words, it was not enough to argue that the comments were critical or harsh. The court needed evidence that they were likely to influence the jury or compromise the fairness of the trial, and according to the judge, that evidence simply was not there. One of the most important factors was timing. The statement cited in the motion had been made roughly 8 to 11 months before the scheduled trial date. From the court's perspective, that gap significantly reduced the likelihood that the comments would have any meaningful impact on potential jurors. People's memories fade, news cycles move on, and public attention shifts rapidly, especially in cases involving celebrities. Because of that, the judge concluded that the motion did not meet the legal standard required to impose sanctions. The ruling denied the request outright. The brevity of the decision was striking. After all the pages of arguments, exhibits, and legal citations presented in the motion, the court resolved the issue in just a short written order. For many observers, that simplicity suggested the judge viewed the matter as relatively straightforward. For the Coravanta side, the decision represented a significant relief. If Lars Harry had been sanctioned or removed from the case, it could have disrupted their entire legal strategy. Instead, the ruling allowed him to continue representing his clients without penalty. For Blake Lively's team, however, the denial was a clear setback. Not only did the court reject the request for sanctions, but it also signaled that the arguments presented had not been persuasive enough to justify judicial intervention, and perhaps more importantly, the ruling reinforced a broader principle about high-profile legal disputes: the existence of public commentary does not automatically mean a trial has been compromised. Courts are careful about restricting what attorneys can say, especially when doing so might raise questions about free speech or a lawyer's duty to advocate for their client. In a case already surrounded by intense media attention, the distinction matters a great deal. Lawyers are allowed to defend their clients publicly, and in situations where accusations are circulating widely in the press, remaining completely silent can sometimes create its own problems. The judge's decision, therefore, did more than resolve a single motion. It quietly reaffirmed the idea that legal battles should ultimately be decided by evidence presented in court, not by the noise surrounding them. And as the Coravanta case continues moving toward trial, that principle may shape many of the arguments and strategies still to come. The denial of the sanctions motion did not just end a procedural dispute. In many ways, it exposed something deeper about how this entire legal conflict has been unfolding. For months, the case surrounding Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the production company Coravanta has existed in two separate arenas at the same time. One is the courtroom itself, where legal rules, evidence, and procedure determine what actually matters. The other is the public sphere, where headlines, commentary videos, and social media discussions often shape perception long before a jury ever hears a single argument. That tension between legal reality and public narrative is what made the sanctions motion so interesting to observers. When Lively's legal team filed their request, the argument was framed as a matter of protecting the fairness of the future trial. According to their position, Lashari's repeated commentary in interviews and public appearances had crossed a professional boundary. They claimed that by speaking about Lively's credibility and character, he was effectively trying to influence potential jurors months before the trial would even begin. But the judge's response made it clear that the legal threshold for proving that kind of harm is extremely high. Courts do not step in simply because attorneys criticize the opposing party in public. To justify sanctions, there must be a real and measurable risk that the statements will interfere with the administration of justice. In practical terms, that usually means showing that the comments are likely to influence the jury pool or compromise the fairness of the trial itself. In this case, the court concluded that Blake Lively's team had not met that burden. What seemed to matter most was the timeline. The statements referenced in the motion had been made long before the expected trial date. At the time they were spoken, the trial was still many months away. In the judge's view, the distance made it difficult to argue that the comments would have a meaningful impact on jurors who might eventually be selected to hear the case. Modern news cycles move quickly. Stories that dominate headlines one week can disappear entirely the next. From the court's perspective, assuming that a statement made nearly a year earlier would still influence jurors months later requires a level of speculation that the law does not support. Because of that reasoning, the judge declined to even fully analyze whether Lashari's statements technically violated Rule 3.6. Instead, he focused on the practical question: would these remarks realistically affect the fairness of the trial? Without clear evidence that they would, the motion simply could not succeed. The result was a short but decisive ruling denying the request for sanctions. For the Coravanta legal team, this outcome was more than just a procedural victory. One of the most serious consequences that Lively's attorneys had hinted at in their motion was the possibility of revoking Lashari's admission to the court. Because he had been granted permission to participate in the case as an out-of-state attorney, the court theoretically had the authority to remove him if it believed he had repeatedly violated professional rules. Had that happened, the Coravanta defense team would have faced a major disruption. Losing a lead attorney in the middle of a complex case can force an entire legal strategy to be rebuilt. Depositions, motions, and trial preparation would all have been affected. Instead, the ruling eliminated that threat completely. At the same time, the decision may carry symbolic meaning as well. Throughout the litigation process, there has been speculation about whether the judge might lean toward one side or the other. High-profile celebrity cases often create that kind of speculation, especially when the legal arguments are closely tied to public perception. But by rejecting the sanctions motion in such straightforward terms, the court signaled that it intends to focus strictly on legal standards rather than on the surrounding drama. That distinction is important because the case itself has become a magnet for media coverage. Every filing, every hearing, and every statement from either side quickly becomes the subject of headlines and online debates. In that environment, it can be easy to confuse public opinion with legal reality. The judge's order serves as a reminder that the two are not the same thing. Another interesting aspect of the situation is how both sides have approached the issue of public messaging. While Lively's team argued that Lashari's comments were inappropriate, the Coravanta side responded by pointing out that public criticism has not been one-sided. Their response filing included examples of statements made by representatives connected to Lively's camp that portrayed Justin Baldoni and his team in a negative light. In other words, they argued that if public commentary is being examined, it should be examined on both sides. This back and forth highlights how complex modern litigation can become when media attention is involved. In the past, most legal battles unfolded largely out of public view until the trial itself. Today, however, information spreads instantly, and narratives can form long before evidence is ever presented in court. That reality creates difficult strategic decisions for lawyers. Remaining completely silent can allow damaging accusations to circulate unchallenged. Speaking publicly, however, always carries the risk of crossing a professional line or triggering disputes like the one that just occurred. For now, the judge's ruling suggests that the balance between those competing concerns will remain relatively broad. Attorneys are allowed to defend their clients and respond to accusations, as long as their statements do not pose a clear threat to the fairness of the proceedings. Looking ahead, the case itself is still moving forward. The denial of the sanctions motion does not resolve any of the core allegations between the parties. Instead, it simply clears one procedural obstacle and allows the litigation to continue toward the next stages of discovery and pretrial preparation. Depositions, document exchanges, and further motions are still expected as both sides build their arguments. In complex civil cases like this one, those processes can take months or even years before a jury ever hears the first opening statement. Another element that observers will be watching closely is how the media reacts to this development. When the sanctions motion was originally filed, many headlines framed it as a serious accusation against Lashari and the Coravanta defense team. Now that the motion has been denied, the question becomes how widely that outcome will be reported. Legal filings often receive significant attention when they contain dramatic allegations, but the resolution of those allegations sometimes receives far less coverage. For people following the case carefully, however, the judge's decision is an important piece of information about how the court views the arguments being presented. It also reinforces another principle that judges frequently emphasize: the fact that something appears in a court filing does not automatically mean it is true. Legal documents often contain claims, accusations, and interpretations that must later be tested through evidence and legal argument. Until that process happens, those claims remain exactly that: see claims. The court itself has repeatedly reminded observers and journalists of this point. In the legal system, allegations can be filed with relatively broad freedom, especially in civil litigation. That freedom exists so that parties can present their arguments and allow the judicial process to evaluate them, but it also means that early filings should not always be interpreted as final conclusions about what actually happened. For viewers, commentators, and readers following the case, the reminder is particularly relevant. Celebrity disputes often attract intense attention, and narratives can form quickly based on incomplete information. The judge's ruling encourages a more cautious approach: watch the evidence, follow the legal arguments, and wait for the process to unfold. For Blake Lively's legal team, the next steps will likely involve refocusing on the substantive claims at the center of the dispute rather than on the conduct of opposing counsel. For the Coravanta side, the decision may provide renewed confidence that their legal strategy will not be disrupted by procedural penalties. Either way, the broader case remains far from finished. If anything, the denial of the sanctions motion may mark the beginning of a new phase. With that dispute resolved, both sides can now concentrate fully on preparing for the larger legal battle that still lies ahead. And in high-profile cases like this one, the most significant developments often occur not in dramatic headlines but in the slow accumulation of evidence, testimony, and legal reasoning that ultimately determines the outcome. For now, one thing is certain: the judge has made it clear that courtroom decisions will be based on proof, not on public narratives. And as the litigation continues, that standard will likely shape every major ruling still to come.